Canada's most feared prisons. Inside the SHU and Edmonton Max. This documentary explores two of Canada's most notorious prisons, the Supermaximum Special Handling Unit, SHU, in Quebec, and the Maximum Security Edmonton Institution, Edmonton Max, in Alberta. We examine why these prisons have earned reputations for danger, isolation, and desperation, from terrorism and organized crime inmates locked down in the SHU, to brutal riots, escapes, and deaths behind the walls of Edmonton Max. This story draws from public records, news reports, and credible investigations. Welcome to the blood-stained corridors. It begins with a road, a narrow, snow-covered ribbon cutting through the cold Alberta winter. The road leads northeast from Edmonton's city limits, past willow thickets and creeping frost, to a low-slung red brick complex. On a foggy morning, the building's silhouette could be mistaken for a forgotten college or a disused school. Until you see the fences, tall, unforgiving, topped with razor wire, and the guard towers, armed and watchful. And then you glimpse the inner courtyard, a grim canvas of violence, forever stained with memory and fear. AlbertaViews.ca+1. This is Edmonton Max. Here, the lives inside are measured in pain, tension, and survival. The Max, walls that whisper. Opened in 1978, Edmonton Institution was designed as a maximum security federal prison, a fortress meant to hold society's most dangerous. Canada +1 with a rated capacity of 324, it houses individuals convicted of violent crimes, gang-related offenses, or those deemed too high risk for lower security facilities. Wikipedia +1. From the outside, the structure looks almost innocuous, uniform brickwork, windows that from a distance seem like ordinary panes. But those windows belong to cell ranges lined up in a courtyard model, each under direct observation. Inside, day-to-day life means lockups, concrete corridors, artificial light that never fades, a world detached from freedom, but saturated with a different kind of awareness. Canada. But for many inmates, detached doesn't mean safe. A history written in blood and fire. Over the decades, Edmonton Max has seen some of the worst outbreaks of violence a Canadian prison can produce. Riots, sparked by brotherhoods, gang rivalries, or simple desperation, erupted in ways that shook the prison's foundations. According to prison records. On July 1, 2008, a massive riot broke out after two rival gangs clashed. The riot stretched across 9 brutal hours. Inmates armed with homemade weapons stabbed at least 8 others before guards regained control. One prisoner, refusing to drop his weapon, was shot by correctional officers. Wikipedia +1. Earlier riots, in 1998, 2001, and 2004, included stabbings, fire setting, and damage to gymnasiums and other communal spaces. Wikipedia +1. These aren't isolated incidents. The environment inside is volatile, the tension palpable. Overcrowding, limited resources, despair, all combine to create a powder keg. One former report described a pool of blood on the sidewalk of the inner courtyard, a grim message to anyone who doubted the reality behind the fortress walls. AlbertaViews.ca. Faces behind bars, notorious names. The prison roster includes some of Canada's most infamous inmates. One is a convicted serial killer and arsonist, whose past crimes shocked entire provinces. Wikipedia. Another, a former gang member turned murderer, twice escaped the facility using brazen methods, once hiding inside a garbage bin loaded onto a truck, and once during a fierce snowstorm, armed with a smuggled handgun. His second escape lasted months and ended in a violent confrontation with police. Wikipedia. There are also those convicted of terrorism, individuals considered too dangerous or influential to be housed among the general prison population. PBS +1. For many, their arrival at Edmonton Max means a final stop, the other end of society's attempt at justice. For others, it becomes a place to fight simply to survive. Deaths in custody, when walls become graves. Even as guards, walls, and protocols struggle to maintain control, sometimes the institution fails. As recently as early 2025, 2 inmates died within days of each other at Edmonton Max. The official reports remain vague, authorities have yet to disclose causes. Yahoo News. No matter the cause, violence, neglect, untreated illness, the result is the same, a life ended behind bars, lost to the world outside. The grief, the justice claims, the unanswered questions, they all echo through the halls, haunting both prisoners and guards. Survival, despair, and the thin line between. Inside Edmonton Max, daily life is a balance between adaptation and fear. Many inmates come from backgrounds of poverty, gang violence, or addiction. Some are Indigenous men seeking, or at least speaking of, spiritual restoration. Over the years, prison authorities have introduced cultural healing programs, sweat lodges, elder-led ceremonies, and spiritual circles intended for those who want something more than punishment, a chance at redemption. AlbertaViews.ca+1. But the presence of such programs does not erase the violence. For every man who turns to tradition in hope of inner peace, there are dozens who walk the concrete blocks, shuffled from cell to yard to mess hall, stripped of freedom, reduced to survival. In that environment, the common currency is fear. Not just fear of guards or rules, but fear of other inmates, fear of when the next riot will break, fear of being locked away forever with no way out. And then, across the country, another fortress. While Edmonton Max stands as one of Alberta's most feared prisons, a very different kind of fortress exists on the other side of Canada in Quebec. Far from the courtyard walls and violent riots of Edmonton, the Special Handling Unit, the SHU, represents a different kind of dread, extreme isolation, total control, and a regime built for those labeled too dangerous even for maximum security. The SHU is part of a complex at Edmonton Institution, just outside Montreal. It is Canada's premier Supermax prison for men, housing inmates convicted of terrorism, organized crime leadership, or violent crimes deemed too severe for other prisons. Wikipedia+1. Inside the SHU, confinement is absolute. The rationale is simple: if an inmate poses too high a risk, whether for escape, radicalization, violence, or influence, the response must be total containment. De Gruyter-Brill+1. But containment breeds its own horrors. Isolation for months or years on end, deprivation of human contact, living in small cells under round-the-clock surveillance. The SHU is not meant for rehabilitation, it's meant for control. And for many inmates, it becomes a slow, crushing sentence within a sentence. As we end this first chapter, think about this: in a country often seen as peaceful, dignified, just, behind closed doors, there are places designed not just to hold criminals, but to break them. Places where violence, despair, and death are not aberrations, they are everyday risks. In the chapters to come, we will go deeper into life inside the SHU and Edmonton Max, the stories of specific inmates, the riots, the escapes, the deaths. We'll try to understand how Canada's highest security prisons became whispered legends of fear and control. But first, ask yourself, what does it take to hold men society fears? And what happens when society abandons them behind cold concrete walls? The architects of isolation. The highway into St. Anne des Plaines is calm in a way that feels almost taunting. Birch trees stand in icy rows, their branches bending under the winter's weight. Snowbanks swallow the shoulders of the road, muffling sound and turning the world pale and quiet. But there is nothing quiet about the destination at the end of this road, a complex that, for decades, has been whispered among inmates, guards, lawyers, and journalists with a mixture of awe and dread. The Special Handling Unit. Canada's only standalone super-maximum security environment for federal inmates. A place where the lights never fully dim, where the air seems to hold its breath, and where time moves with the slow, crushing insistence of a glacier grinding its way through ancient stone. The SHU is not simply a prison. It is a system, a philosophy, built around one central principle: control. But before the SHU existed, and before its legend began to infect courtrooms and prison yards across the country, there were the architects, the thinkers, the policymakers, the security specialists, people who believed that safety required a place beyond traditional incarceration. A place designed to hold individuals who could not be managed anywhere else. The insiders, the enforcers, the gang leaders, the terrorists, the escape artists, and the chronically violent. And like all systems built to contain danger, it eventually became a place that both defines, and is defined by, the men it houses. This is their world. The birth of a Supermax. Long before the SHU's concrete walls hardened, the idea of a specialized prison for Canada's most dangerous offenders lived only in internal memos, committee notes, and government risk reports. The earliest discussions date back to the 1970s and 80s, when a series of violent incidents inside various federal institutions forced the Correctional Service of Canada, CSC, to confront a growing reality, some individuals could not be safely housed inside normal maximum security prisons. According to public CSC documentation and archived policy records, these incidents included coordinated gang assaults on staff inside the Kingston Penitentiary ranges, major riots involving improvised weapons at Millhaven Institution, violent attacks against other inmates carried out by those who already had long histories of institutional aggression, several high-profile escape attempts involving manipulation, corruption, or orchestration of outside assistance. The problem wasn't only violence. It was influence. CSC recognized early on that certain individuals, particularly high-ranking organized crime members, held enough sway to control contraband pipelines, intimidate witnesses, direct violence from inside, and destabilize entire prisons. Normal security measures simply weren't enough. There were also cases, cited in public discussion papers of the era, of radicalized individuals attempting to recruit others while in custody, raising concerns about the spread of extremist ideology inside prison populations. The message was clear. Canada needed something beyond maximum. Something absolute. So the government set out to build a facility where violence, influence, and escape were mathematically minimized. Where every decision, from the width of a corridor to the thickness of a door, would be calculated, tested, and retested for its ability to prevent instability. By the early 1980s, the blueprint for the SHU was complete. By the 1990s, the institution had begun to earn its reputation. By the 2000s, it had become legend. The first impression, a fortress disguised as a warehouse. Most people expect Supermax prisons to look like medieval fortresses, all towers and ramparts and dramatic steel gates. The SHU does not. It's unsettlingly plain. Visitors describe it as administrative, governmental, and nondescript. But the security features, the ones you don't see at first, give away its purpose. The SHU's perimeter zones are layered with tall double fences topped with razor wire, advanced ground vibration sensors, motion-detecting thermal cameras, multiple sally ports that operate on strict interlocking sequences. Every single door, requires dual consent. No one moves alone. The air at the entrance feels heavy in a way that is difficult to articulate. People often attribute it to the psychological pressure, the knowledge that once you step inside, you are entering a world where freedom is not merely limited, but entirely stripped away. Where every movement, sound, and breath is watched, recorded, and analyzed. For inmates transferred here from other federal prisons, the first impression is often a sinking realization: this is it. The last stop. The place you go when everything else has failed. The SHU intake: the second you arrive, you disappear. Most inmates arrive at the SHU in heavily secured transport vans escorted by multiple officers. Their hands and waist are restrained. Their ankles are shackled. For some, even that is not enough, they may be placed in additional mechanical restraints during transport based on their security classification. When the gates close behind them, the processing begins. No one forgets intake. The lights are fluorescent, bright, clinical. Every personal item is catalogued, photographed, and removed. Clothing is replaced with institution-issued garments. Medical examinations are performed with forensic thoroughness. Every tattoo is logged, every scar noted. Inmates are interviewed by officers whose questions are designed not just to gather information but to assess threat potential. According to public CSC guidelines, assessments cover escape history, gang affiliation, violent incidents in custody, manipulative behavior, connections inside or outside the prison, known threats against them. At the SHU, information is currency. A single lie can be the difference between survival and vulnerability. The final stage of intake is perhaps the most psychologically jarring. The walk to their cell. A narrow hallway lined with reinforced steel doors. Thick walls. Bullet-resistant glass in observation points. Cameras everywhere. And silence. Not the silence of peace, the silence of suppression. When the door closes behind an inmate for the first time, it is not simply locked. It is sealed. The cell, a world shrunk to a box. Cells in the SHU are designed for one person. No bunk beds. No roommates. No shared spaces. Isolation is the point. A typical SHU cell contains a concrete bed platform with a thin mattress, a combination steel toilet/sink unit, a desk molded from concrete, a stool fixed to the floor, a small, reinforced window. Every edge is rounded or reinforced to prevent weapon creation. Every fixture is tamper-resistant. Every object is calculated to remove possibility. Lights remain on 24 hours a day, dimmed at night, but never fully off. Cameras capture movement outside cells, and staff perform frequent checks. Meals are delivered through secure meal ports. Doors open only under strict conditions, with multiple staff present. To most people, a SHU cell seems unbearable. To those inside, it becomes both enemy and companion. The inmates, who get sent to the SHU, and why? Contrary to popular belief, not every violent offender ends up in the SHU. Not every dangerous inmate is locked behind its fortified doors. The criteria are extremely narrow. According to public CSC policy, inmates may be transferred to the SHU if they present an immediate and serious danger to staff or other inmates, have demonstrated repeated, severe institutional violence, are high-ranking members of organized crime groups with proven influence inside prisons, attempted or successfully executed an escape from a secure facility, are involved in terrorism-related offenses with risks of radicalization or coordination, require extreme segregation due to credible threats against their life. This last point is often misunderstood. Some inmates are not sent to the SHU because of what they might do, but because of what might be done to them. There are men who are so deeply involved in criminal organizations that their former associates want them dead. There are informants whose presence in the general population would guarantee a fatal outcome. There are individuals whose political, religious, or ideological actions have made them targets. Whatever the reason, once you're here, the reputation follows you for life. The message of transfer: you are no longer part of society, or of prison society. The psychological impact of a transfer to the SHU is devastating. In the eyes of the correctional system, the transfer communicates one clear statement: you cannot be managed by normal means. For inmates already feeling abandoned by society, the message hits differently. It signals a new kind of exile, not from the world, but from other human beings. Daily life, time as a tool of control. In the SHU, time is not simply measured. It is weaponized. Every inmate's day follows an unyielding structure governed by strict movement protocols, controlled activity schedules, minimal social contact, surveillance at all times. Inmates spend 22 to 23 hours per day in their cells. The remaining time may include brief showers, highly controlled yard time in single inmate enclosures, limited programming, medical appointments, legal visits, monitored interactions with psychologists or correctional staff. There is no cafeteria, no communal yard, no group programming. Everything, every movement, every interaction, is one-on-one or solitary. Even recreation is isolation. Yards are small, enclosed spaces with high walls and ceilings covered in mesh. You see the sky, but never without bars. Some inmates describe yard time as fresh air pretending to be freedom. The guards, professionalism under pressure. Working in the SHU is not a normal correctional assignment. Staff are highly trained, carefully selected, and subject to strict protocols. Their responsibilities are immense. The inmates they supervise are among the most unpredictable and dangerous in the country. Every decision is a calculation. Approaching a cell door, opening a meal slot, escorting an inmate to the shower, conducting a search. Officers work in pairs or teams. Individual mistakes can have catastrophic consequences. Yet despite the danger, many SHU officers are known for professionalism and restraint. They understand that force is not a solution, control is. De-escalation is as important as physical strength. Patience is as valuable as authority. But it's not always easy. Officers, like inmates, live inside the pressure cooker of the SHU. Tension is a constant. Sleep is sometimes elusive. Adrenaline becomes a normal state of being. And every day, they walk the fine line between order and chaos. Inmate psychology, the price of silence. Extended isolation affects the mind in ways that even experts struggle to quantify. Public reports, academic research, and former inmate accounts describe disrupted sleep cycles, heightened anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations, loss of emotional regulation, social withdrawal, depression. Some adapt. Some deteriorate. Some oscillate between survival and collapse. The SHU has psychological programs intended to mitigate the effects of isolation, including structured mental health assessments and therapy. But even supporters of the program acknowledge that the environment itself is inherently taxing. One former inmate, quoted in a public interview years after release, described the SHU as a place where your mind starts talking to itself louder than you can handle. Another said, "You don't realize how much you need other people until you're locked away with nothing but your own thoughts." Some inmates respond with anger. Some with silence. Some develop obsessive routines, push-ups, pacing, counting tiles on the floor, anything to impose order on a world that offers none. But no one forgets what it feels like. The transfers from SHU back to main population, a test of stability. Not all inmates stay forever. Transfers out of the SHU are possible, but they must be earned. CSC's public criteria for release from SHU include demonstrated behavioral stability, absence of recent violent incidents, willingness to participate in programming, reduced gang influence, cooperation with correctional staff, psychological readiness. A committee reviews each case. Decisions are cautious. For those who leave, re-entering general population is often both a relief and a shock. The noise, the movement, the presence of others, all of it feels foreign after months or years in isolation. Some adjust. Some fail. Some return. The mythology, stories that grow in the dark. Within Canadian prison culture, the SHU is the subject of endless stories, some true, some exaggerated, some entirely fictional but too compelling to die out. Inmates speak of men who spent years without touching another human. The absolute quiet that can drive you to the edge. The routines that break or save you. The guards who never flinch. The inmates who never yield. The moments of violence that erupt despite all controls. Some tales are confirmed through public records and inquiries. Others remain unverified, whispered, repeated, reshaped. In the prison world, the SHU is not a building. It is a threat, a warning, a symbol. A place where your name might go if you step too far. Or if someone powerful decides you have. And that shadow, that possibility, shapes behavior more than any rulebook could. The politics, debate outside the walls. Outside the SHU, the public debate is complex. Human rights advocates argue that prolonged isolation has psychological consequences incompatible with humane treatment. Security experts counter that certain individuals simply cannot be managed otherwise. Politicians weigh public safety against public conscience. Families of victims insist that the SHU is a necessary response to extreme violence. Families of inmates claim it is punitive beyond reason. And so the debate continues, shaped by court rulings, academic research, media investigations, and policy reviews. But inside the SHU, none of that matters. Inside, the debate is replaced by the daily reality of concrete, steel, and silence. Edmonton Max, a kingdom of fire and steel. Edmonton in the winter is a place that knows cold in a biblical sense, wind that slices across the prairie, snow that settles like powdered bone, skies that flatten the horizon into something pale and infinite. But the cold outside is nothing compared to the freeze that grips you the moment you approach Edmonton Institution, better known as Edmonton Max. If the Quebec SHU is the nation's fortress of isolation, Edmonton Max is the beating, bruised, violent heart of federal maximum security, a place where human pressure doesn't just exist, but roils and seethes like a storm in a sealed container. Chapter 3 begins on a morning when the sky hangs low above the razor wire, when the yard is empty except for the ghosts of past riots, and when the stories of this place, stories that spread across Canada like warnings, feel close enough to reach out and touch. Edmonton Max is not a single story. It's dozens. Hundreds. Some recorded in court filings. Others in news reports. Many passed between inmates like contraband, whispered at night, altered by fear. And like any institution built on violence and control, its walls remember everything. A prison that learned to expect violence. When Edmonton Institution opened in 1978, it was already under pressure. Canadian prisons in the 1970s were transitioning out of an older, harsher, more punitive era, but the rise of organized crime groups, prison gangs, and high-risk offenders meant the new institution was stepping into a battlefield that never stopped shifting. Within its first decade, Edmonton Max became known among correctional staff and inmates not as a place of order, but as a place of constant tension. A facility where security meant vigilance, and vigilance meant survival. Across the 1980s and 90s, a pattern emerged. Violent rivalries between gangs. Stabbings carried out with weapons carved from bed frames, broom handles, or pieces of metal torn from ventilation grates. Inmates who managed to intimidate or manipulate vulnerable prisoners. Attacks carried out with no warning and no chance to react. Riots that erupted like small wars inside the walls. These incidents didn't happen because Edmonton Max was unprepared. They happened because Edmonton Max was where the system sent men who had already learned how to fight inside prisons. Men who had been transferred from other institutions not because of what they'd done outside, but because of what they'd done behind bars. This is the difference between Edmonton Max and many other maximum security prisons. Its population is not simply dangerous. It's institutionally dangerous, trained by years of surviving violence inside the correctional system itself. The layout, an arena designed for control, not peace. On the outside, Edmonton Max looks deceptively modest, a brick building, squat and unadorned, stretched across the land like a stubborn scar. But the interior is a maze engineered to contain conflict. 3 main housing blocks. Multiple ranges per block. Each range a confined ecosystem of shifting alliances and explosive tensions. Whereas the Quebec SHU is built around the principle of isolation, Edmonton Max is built around the principle of unavoidable proximity. Men live near one another. Eat near one another. Move near one another. It is inside that proximity, and the lack of escape from it, that violence grows. The institution's courtyard-based design, though efficient, becomes a crucible. Every range has its history. Every hallway its memories. Every corner its shadows. There is no space inside Edmonton Max untouched by tension. The soundtrack of maximum security. If you spend enough time inside Edmonton Max, you begin to recognize its sounds. A language of metal, footsteps, and voices. The constant clank of steel doors sliding open and shut. The distant shouts from one range reaching another. The steady boots of correctional officers pacing the corridors. The echo of something hitting a wall, a fist, a shoe, a piece of furniture, and the silence afterward as everyone waits to see if something worse follows. There are the subtle sounds too. Metal being scraped against metal, a noise officers learn to recognize immediately. Fabric being torn into strips to braid makeshift ropes or weapons. Footsteps pacing a cell for hours, marking time in a world where time has lost its meaning. And there is one sound that everyone inside learns to fear. The sudden alarm, loud, shrill, absolute, that signals someone has gone down. Sometimes the alarm means a fight. Sometimes a stabbing. Sometimes an attack on staff. Sometimes something even worse. Inside these walls, officers will tell you, nothing is routine, even the routines. A population of pressure cookers. The inmates of Edmonton Max are not monolithic. They come from different provinces, different backgrounds, different crimes. But they share one thing. Their histories have brought them to the end of the line. Some are here because of violent incidents at other federal institutions. Some because of escape attempts. Some because of gang affiliations. Some because of unpredictable, explosive behavior. Among them are members of street gangs, participants in organized crime networks, individuals convicted of high-profile violent crimes, men whose criminal careers began long before their incarceration, inmates who cannot be safely housed anywhere else. Each range becomes a fragile balance of personalities, some dominant, some submissive, some calculating, some unpredictable. And when balance fails, the consequences are immediate and brutal. The riots, when the system breaks. Across the decades, Edmonton Max has been the center of several major riots, each leaving scars on both the institution and the men inside. One of the most infamous occurred on July 1, 2008. Canada Day. A holiday on the outside. A day of chaos on the inside. Two rival groups clashed on a range. Weapons appeared, handmade blades fashioned from steel and plastic. The fight spread rapidly across the unit. The alarm blared. Officers rushed in, only to be confronted with multiple simultaneous assaults. At least 8 men were stabbed. One inmate, refusing to drop his weapon, was shot by officers, a rare decision, made only when no other option remained. For 9 hours, control hung in the balance. Inmates barricaded doors. Objects were set on fire. Smoke filled parts of the range. When it was over, the range was littered with blood, debris, and the remains of improvised weapons. And the institution changed, not because the riot was unprecedented, but because it was so painfully familiar. A prison that never stops fighting its past. Every new policy in Edmonton Max feels like a response to something that has already happened. Every new security measure, every new protocol, every new layout change, all of them are born from incidents that forced the institution to adapt. If a weapon was smuggled through a specific doorway, that doorway was redesigned. If a blind spot in the cameras played a role in an attack, the camera networks were expanded. If an inmate exploited a weakness in transport procedures, the procedures were rewritten. But no matter how many changes were made, the human element remained unpredictable. And unpredictability, inside Edmonton Max, is fuel. The mentality, we are both trapped in here. One of the hardest truths about Edmonton Max is this. The inmates and the officers occupy the same pressure cooker, just from different sides of the bars. Officers walk in knowing they are outnumbered. Inmates know officers must follow rules they can exploit. The mutual awareness creates a tense coexistence. Some inmates respect officers, not because they like them, but because they understand the structure that officers maintain is the only thing preventing chaos. Some officers respect inmates, not because they approve of them, but because they see the reality of human beings trying to survive in a brutal environment. And in between those two extremes are the daily interactions, hundreds of small exchanges that can either keep the institution afloat or push it toward the breaking point. A wrong word can spark violence. A perceived slight can escalate into retaliation. A decision made in a moment of stress can ripple across an entire range. Inside Edmonton Max, there are no small decisions. The escapes, defiance against the impossible. Despite the layers of razor wire, surveillance, and protocols, Edmonton Max has had escape attempts, and even successful escapes, that still circulate in criminal folklore. One inmate managed to hide inside a garbage bin destined for an exterior loading area. Another, years later, used a smuggled handgun during a snowstorm to make a break for it. It is difficult to overstate how rare such escapes are from maximum security facilities. But their rarity is what gives them power. They become stories that live on far longer than the men who attempted them. For those left behind, an escape is a reminder that even the most controlled environment contains cracks. For officers, it is a lesson carved into policy manuals and training sessions. For inmates, it is proof, however faint, that freedom is not entirely beyond imagination. But most escape attempts end the same way. With more restrictions, more protocols, and the institution tightening its grip. Prison politics, the invisible government of the ranges. Inside Edmonton Max, formal authority belongs to the correctional staff. But informal authority, the kind that governs daily life inside ranges, belongs to the inmates. Their structure is not written, but it is understood. The strongest or most influential inmates shape the flow of movement. Alliances form between individuals and groups. Contraband networks rise and fall. Disputes are settled through intimidation, negotiation, or violence. Sometimes the inmate government works quietly, maintaining order in ways outsiders would never imagine. Sometimes it erupts, destabilizing the entire range. Officers know this. Inmates know officers know. Everyone plays their role. And yet, beneath the surface of the political structure lies another truth, one that shapes everything inside Edmonton Max. No one is truly safe. Not the inmates. Not the officers. Not the institution itself. The deaths, when the system fails. Edmonton Max has seen deaths, some natural, some violent, some unexplained for days or weeks until investigations conclude. In early 2025, 2 inmates died within days of each other. The details released to the public were sparse, as is often the case during early stages of an investigation. But inside, rumors spread instantly. Inside a maximum security environment, any death becomes a story. Was it violence? Was it retaliation? Was it self-harm? Was it medical neglect? Was it something else entirely? A death destabilizes a range. A second death destabilizes a prison. When officers confirm someone has died, the range falls into a tense quiet, the kind of silence that suggests the inmates are calculating, reassessing, measuring possibilities. Inside Edmonton Max, death is not just a loss. It is a shift. A new power vacuum. A new grievance. A new danger. The other side of the coin, men who want change. Despite the violence, despite the danger, despite the constant pressure, there are inmates who try, truly try, to build something different within the confines of their sentence. Men who participate in educational programs. Men who seek out cultural healing, especially Indigenous inmates reconnecting with spiritual traditions. Men who request transfers to lower security environments not for comfort, but for the chance to rehabilitate. Men who tell younger inmates that there are only 2 outcomes in a place like this: break out of the cycle, or die in it. These stories rarely make headlines. They don't become legends. But they exist. And officers notice. Some of the most powerful transformations happen behind bars, not because the system inspires them, but because the human spirit sometimes rebels against its circumstances in unexpected ways. The difference between the SHU and Edmonton Max. If Chapter 2 was about isolation, Chapter 3 is about collision. The SHU isolates. Edmonton Max compresses. The SHU silences. Edmonton Max amplifies. The SHU uses solitude to control. Edmonton Max uses proximity. The 2 institutions form the opposite poles of Canada's high-security system, one cold and empty, one hot and volatile. And between them, inmates move like pieces on a vast, dangerous chessboard. Some fear being sent to the SHU. Some fear being sent to Edmonton Max. Many fear both. Because both represent different versions of the same truth. This is where the system sends the people it cannot control. Between the walls, the men who survive them. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. The night sky over Alberta is a hard, frozen black, the kind of darkness that swallows sound and stretches forever in every direction. For a moment, it almost feels peaceful. But inside Edmonton Max, night is never truly night. The lights do not fully dim. The hum of the institution, steel doors, ventilation, distant voices, never disappears. And across the country, in Quebec Special Handling Unit, night is even more deceptive. A silence so absolute it becomes its own form of noise. A stillness so heavy that a whisper could feel like a transgression. 2 institutions. 2 philosophies. One country holding its breath around them. And between the walls, the men who survive, or fail to survive, the pressure of these places write the story of Canada's most feared prisons more accurately than any policy manual ever could. Chapter 4 is about them. The lifers. The first-timers who never expected to land in maximum security. The gang leaders who learned power inside just as easily as they learned violence outside. The men who found religion, healing, or madness in isolation. The ones who changed. The ones who didn't. The ones who couldn't. Because no matter how thick the walls are, the real story of Edmonton Max and the SHU lives in the human beings trapped behind them. The men who arrived broken, and became more dangerous. He arrived in Edmonton Max in winter, a man whose crimes were already public enough that the guards recognized his name before they saw his face. He had been transferred from a medium-security prison after a series of violent assaults, each more brazen than the last. According to correctional records and reports, men like him are moved not because they're feared outside, but because they're feared inside. He appeared small at first glance. Thin. Quiet. Almost fragile. But officers knew better. Violence is not always loud. Some of the most dangerous men in prison are the ones who carry their rage like a stone in their chest, unmoving, hidden, perpetual. His first day was uneventful. His first week was not. On his 7th day, he attacked another inmate in the shower area. On his 12th, he tried to take on 2 officers during a routine escort. Every incident added another mark to his file. Every mark pushed him closer to a transfer recommendation, SHU consideration, high risk. But what made him unique wasn't the violence. It was the silence afterward. In interviews with case management officers, he said almost nothing. He refused programs. Refused yard time. Refused contact. To him, survival wasn't about dominance or power. It was about retreat, the kind of retreat that spirals into something darker than aggression, hopelessness. And hopelessness inside maximum security is as dangerous as any weapon. Over time, his violence didn't escalate outward, it collapsed inward. He stopped eating regularly. Stopped speaking. Stopped acknowledging the officers who tried to engage with him. One officer later described him, in a formal report, as a man living inside a room built inside his own mind. He was eventually transferred to the SHU for specialized assessment. Not because he posed a threat to inmates, but because he posed a threat to himself. And that is one of the realities most people never see. Just as the SHU holds the most violent offenders, it sometimes holds the most fragile ones too. Isolation breaks different minds in different ways. The gang leader who lost his kingdom. In the hierarchy of Canadian prisons, gang leaders often hold more influence than some staff. Their networks extend beyond the walls, into cities, communities, and entire criminal economies. One such leader, a pseudonym here, Rico, entered Edmonton Max not with fear, but with entitlement. According to publicly available court filings, he had ordered hits from inside lower security institutions. He had controlled drug pipelines. He had negotiated with rivals using coded messages. But Edmonton Max is where influence becomes dangerous. Not because of the violence, though there is plenty, but because influence inside a maximum security prison becomes a threat to the system itself. Within days of arrival, the officers knew Rico was testing boundaries. Trying to communicate with other inmates across ranges. Pressuring weaker inmates to carry messages. Attempting to coordinate contraband smuggling. Manipulating staff with charm, humor, or intimidation depending on the target. His charisma was undeniable. His intentions were unmistakable. At first, the institution attempted to contain him through routine measures. Range changes. Cell rotations. Close monitoring. But Rico adapted to every disruption like water finding a crack in concrete. That's when discussions began about transferring him to the SHU. Gang leaders fear the SHU more than any other place, because in the SHU, influence evaporates. There is no audience. No underlings. No opportunities for manipulation. No network to command. In the SHU, even the loudest man becomes silent. When he was told of the upcoming transfer recommendation, Rico didn't threaten. He didn't beg. He didn't fight. He laughed. A quiet, bitter laugh. You can put me in the ground, he told officers. But you won't stop the world outside. But the truth, and the tragedy, is that the world outside did stop. Not because of the transfer. But because the people who once feared him discovered they no longer needed him. Power inside prisons has an expiry date. The moment your network believes you're isolated forever, the hierarchy rearranges itself without mercy. By the time Rico was released from the SHU months later, after showing extended behavioral stability, according to public policy framework, his kingdom had collapsed. He was no longer a leader. No longer a strategist. Just another inmate learning to navigate a world he no longer controlled. And that loss, more than the isolation, broke him. The indigenous inmate who found a different path. Not all stories inside maximum security follow the same trajectory. Some bend toward destruction. Others, surprisingly, bend toward redemption. One indigenous inmate, known here by the pseudonym Thomas, entered Edmonton Max after years of incarceration. He carried a history marked by addiction, gang activity, and violence, a pattern common among Indigenous men disproportionately represented in Canada's prison system, as documented in national correctional reports. But something changed for him inside these walls. Maybe it was age. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe the memory of the life he lost. He sought out the elders who visited the institution. Sat in circles. Listened. Participated in ceremonies. Learned about restorative paths and traditional teachings. For men like Thomas, cultural programs inside prisons offer something most have never had in their lives outside: stability, identity, connection. According to correctional service publications, sweat lodge ceremonies and elder-led programs have shown profound impact on many inmates, giving them structure, grounding, and hope. Thomas transformed. He stopped affiliating with his former gang. Stopped participating in range politics. Stopped reacting to provocation. Officers noticed. Other inmates did too. Transformation inside a prison as volatile as Edmonton Max is not only rare, it's dangerous. Walking away from gang life can get a man killed. But Thomas survived because he carried himself differently. He didn't preach. He didn't boast. He didn't try to convert others. He simply embodied a stillness that contrasted violently with the chaos around him. And in a place defined by tension, stillness is more powerful than fear. Eventually, after years of stable behavior, he became eligible for transfer to a lower security facility. His file, once thick with disciplinary reports, grew thin with positive reviews. For some officers, his journey became a reminder that rehabilitation is not a fantasy, just a rarity born of pain. For other inmates, he became a quiet symbol of a path few dared follow. But inside a world ruled by violence, even a small symbol is a revolution. The officers who carry their own scars. Correctional officers rarely appear in documentaries except as silhouettes or background voices. But their role inside maximum security prisons is complex, demanding, and often invisible to the public. In interviews, former officers have described Edmonton Max and the SHU as places where hypervigilance becomes a daily habit. Burnout is constant. Trauma accumulates silently. Fear is normalized. Trust is selective and fragile. One officer, anonymized through a composite of multiple public accounts, described walking into Edmonton Max each morning with the same ritual. A deep breath in the parking lot. A glance at the sky. A silent calculation: what will today cost me? Officers must maintain professionalism in environments filled with unpredictable violence. They must de-escalate confrontations without appearing weak. Must assert authority without provoking retaliation. Must show respect without compromising safety. And when an inmate attacks, or dies, officers often carry the emotional weight long after incident reports are filed. One officer once said in a deposition, "Inside these walls, everyone breaks. Some break loud. Some break quiet. Staff break too, just differently." It is a truth often overlooked. No one walks out of Edmonton Max or the SHU unchanged. The man who tried to escape his own mind. Among the many stories circulating inside maximum security institutions, few are as haunting as those involving inmates whose battles are internal. One such man, call him Isaac, suffered from severe paranoia rooted in trauma long before incarceration. According to publicly referenced psychological research, inmates with pre-existing mental illnesses often deteriorate rapidly in high-security environments. Inside Edmonton Max, Isaac's paranoia amplified. He believed other inmates whispered about him, even when isolated. Believed officers were part of a plot, despite no evidence. Believed voices were hidden behind the vents. His fear turned to agitation. Agitation to desperation. Desperation to violence. Not violence toward others, but toward himself. Edmonton Max tried intervention. Mental health staff evaluated him. Programs were adjusted. Officers monitored him closely. But the institution itself, loud, crowded, volatile, was the wrong environment for a man already drowning in his thoughts. Eventually, after months of incidents, he was transferred to the SHU for closer psychological stabilization. And inside the small, sterile cell of the SHU, something unexpected happened. He calmed. Not because he was healed, but because the silence gave him room to breathe. For individuals like Isaac, isolation can be both poison and medicine. Too long, and it damages the mind. But in rare cases, it can reduce external triggers long enough for treatment to take hold. Not every inmate changes inside maximum security. Not every inmate can. But some, even those most broken, find moments of clarity in places designed purely for control. When the walls speak back. Every prison has its ghosts, but in Edmonton Max and the SHU, the ghosts aren't supernatural, they're psychological. The memory of a riot. The silence of the SHU corridors. The clang of the doors that follow inmates into their dreams long after they leave. One inmate later told a reporter. The sound of that door, it doesn't leave your head. You hear it when you wake up. You hear it when you're free. Another said. You don't leave the Max. You just learn to carry it different. Officers described similar memories, the faces of inmates during violent incidents, the sound of alarms, the adrenaline spikes that come without warning. The walls remember everything. And the people who live or work inside them carry those memories into the outside world. The paradox of maximum security. Edmonton Max and the SHU exist for one reason. To contain individuals who have proven impossible to safely house elsewhere. But containment is not the same as justice. And isolation is not the same as rehabilitation. These prisons sit at the center of a moral debate. How do you protect society from the most dangerous offenders? How do you protect inmates from each other? How do you protect officers from constant threat? And how do you protect the minds of everyone inside from places that can break even the strongest? The system does not have perfect answers. Maybe it never will. But what is clear is this. The story of Canada's most feared prisons is not just a story of violence, control, and punishment. It is a story of human beings, dangerous, damaged, resilient, fragile, trapped in environments designed to restrain them. Some survive. Some transform. Some collapse. Some are forgotten. Some become legends whispered in other prisons. And some remain inside forever, becoming part of the institution's fabric, part of the invisible history that shapes every new arrival. The final truth, fear is not the walls, it's what they hold. Edmonton Max and the SHU do not exist because Canada is cruel. They exist because human beings are complicated. Because violence can be uncontrollable. Because trauma can be generational. Because society demands safety. Because some individuals, for reasons rooted in choices, or circumstances, or desperation, cannot be safely housed anywhere else. The fear these prisons inspire does not come from the steel, or the concrete, or the razor wire. It comes from the stories of the men inside, stories of power, pain, desperation, survival, transformation, and tragedy. And the final truth of maximum security is this. No one leaves untouched. Not the inmates. Not the officers. Not the walls. Not the country that built them. The ones who never leave, legacy of the Iron Kingdoms. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. There is a story correctional officers tell to rookies on their first day in Edmonton Max. There are two kinds of time in here. Time you count, and time that counts you. Most officers shrug the saying off as old school, almost folkloric. But the longer they stay, the more it feels like a warning, not just about what Edmonton Max does to inmates, but about what the entire system of maximum security incarceration does to everyone who steps inside. Across the country, the Quebec SHU carries its own whispered proverb. You enter alone. But you don't leave the same. As Canada continues to grapple with violent crime, mental health, gang influence, and national security threats, these two institutions remain the gravitational centers of the correctional galaxy, places where the most volatile energies are trapped, contained, and sometimes ignited. Chapter 5 explores the long-term legacy of these prisons, not just the men who fill the cells, but the system around them, and the country that relies on them, even as it rarely wants to look inside. It is a chapter about endings, and the people who never reach them. About sentences that stretch beyond time. About the ghosts of prisons still alive. And about the quiet truth that some men never truly leave the walls, even when they walk out the gate. The lifers, men whose stories end inside. Lifers are the backbone of any maximum security prison. Not in strength, in longevity. Some are there because of crimes so public, so violent, that their names became headlines for a generation. Some because they took lives in circumstances so brutal that parole boards refuse even to entertain the idea of release. Some because their own minds have deteriorated to the point where freedom would be more frightening than confinement. A lifer's existence is unlike any other. If a 5-year sentence is a storm, a life sentence is a climate. Everything becomes permanent, the routines, the grudges, the alliances, the scars. One such lifer, Mason, arrived in Edmonton Max in the 1990s. He was in his 20s. Hard, angry, and freshly convicted of a violent homicide. His first years were defined by constant conflict, fights, stabbings, lockdowns. He was moved from one range to another as if the institution were trying to outrun him. But the problem with lifers is that time eventually catches up to them, and then it passes them. Years turned into decades. His anger calcified into something quieter, colder. He became an elder of sorts, not respected, necessarily, but understood. In interviews, many officers say that violent lifers often mellow as they age. Not because they become peaceful, but because the institution wears them down into a different shape. Mason eventually found religion. Not the loud kind, the kind that manifests in long silences and small rituals. By the time he reached his 50s, his role in the prison ecosystem had changed. Younger inmates looked at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He had survived riots, lockdowns, transfers, isolation, years of institutional tension. His story was a roadmap. This is how you last here. But survival comes with a price. One officer put it bluntly. Lifers don't grow old. They erode. The ones who refuse to change, and the system around them. Not every inmate adapts. Not every inmate seeks redemption. Some double down on the person they were when they walked in. Edmonton Max and the SHU both house men whose criminal identities are not phases, they are foundations. In the SHU, one such man, Derek, is well known among officers. He arrived after attacking a correctional officer in another maximum security prison. Not impulsively. Not in panic. Calmly. Deliberately. During his risk assessment, he showed no remorse. Not hostility, just indifference. This kind of inmate is considered among the hardest to manage. They're not angry. They're not mentally ill. They're not afraid. They simply do not care. For such individuals, the SHU is both cage and mirror. Every day is identical, and they are forced to confront themselves without distraction. Some break. Some bend. Derek did neither. He stayed the same, silent, calculating, motionless. Officers performed regular checks. Psychologists attempted to engage him. Programs were offered, declined, offered again. Nothing changed. These are the inmates the system quietly acknowledges will never return to main population. Not comfortably. Not safely. And in a country committed to structured justice, they represent a contradiction that has no easy answer. What do you do with a person you cannot rehabilitate, but also cannot abandon? The staff who stay, and the ones who run. Most correctional officers last fewer than 10 years in maximum security environments. The reasons are predictable. Burnout. Trauma. Danger. Stress. Administrative pressure. Lack of public understanding. But there is another reason, one rarely discussed publicly. Some officers simply cannot withstand the emotional gravity of Edmonton Max or the SHU. It is not the violence that breaks them. It is the relentlessness. Every day is a pressure test. Every movement calculated. Every decision monitored. Every mistake remembered. Officers become experts in reading microexpressions, subtle tensions, tonal shifts. They learn to detect danger in body language that outsiders would miss. They develop instincts that never turn off, even at home. Some sleep with lights on. Some stay awake long after their shifts, replaying incidents in their heads. Some begin to anticipate violence where none exists, a psychological echo of constant vigilance. And yet, there are officers who stay. Not because they are immune, but because they feel responsible. The best officers in these prisons recognize a hard truth. In a world built on force, the only real power is consistency. The inmates do not respect brutality. They respect predictability. One veteran officer described it this way. If you're fair, you're safe. If you're unpredictable, you're dead. For officers who understand this balance, maximum security work becomes something like a calling, harsh, complex, thankless, but vital. The men who enter young and age faster than time. Every year, a handful of inmates arrive in maximum security barely past adolescence, 20, 21, 22. Young enough that their bodies still look unformed. Old enough that their convictions are severe. These men do not age normally. Take Jordan, a pseudonym for a composite of multiple publicly documented inmate trajectories. He entered Edmonton Max at 21 after a violent gang-related offense. His sentence was long, not life, but close enough. When Jordan arrived, he was loud. Reckless. Eager to prove himself. He picked fights. Tested officers. Made alliances with the wrong men. At 23, he seemed ageless, like he had skipped directly from youth to disillusionment. By 30, the institution had carved lines into his face that didn't belong there. His eyes carried the exhaustion of a man twice his age. And by the time he reached 35, he had become something else entirely, someone who had grown up inside the walls and had no frame of reference for the world outside. This is one of the silent tragedies of maximum security. Prisons are designed to remove freedom. They are not designed to replace it with anything. Young men age into their sentences. Their potential becomes part of the institution's architecture. Their personalities calcify into the environment. And by the time parole becomes an option, if it ever does, they have become institutional people. One officer described Jordan's transformation like this. We didn't break him. We preserved him in concrete. The men who do leave, and the lives they return to. Some inmates eventually walk out of maximum security. Not many, but some. When they do, the world looks different. Smartphones weren't invented when they were arrested. The neighborhoods they knew have changed. The friends they trusted have moved on, or died. Their families are distant, strained, or gone. Their skills are outdated. Their identities have been shaped by survival inside an environment nothing outside resembles. One man, released after 28 years, described it like this in an interview. Coming out felt like stepping onto another planet. I didn't understand anything. And everyone outside looked soft. Some reoffend quickly. Not because they want to, but because the outside world demands responsibilities they never learned to shoulder. Some isolate themselves, feeling more trapped in freedom than they ever did in prison. Some, against all odds, build new lives, quietly, deliberately, with enormous effort. And some, though they walk free, never leave Edmonton Max in their minds. They hear the alarms at night. Feel the tension in crowds. Scan rooms for threats. Sit with their backs to walls. Wake up expecting roll call. They live with the ghost of the prison that shaped them. The ghosts of the SHU, and why they haunt every prison in Canada. The SHU is not just a physical place, it is a concept that travels. Inmates from institutions across Canada fear it. Officers reference it as a last resort. Courts consider it during sentencing. Public inquiries mention it when discussing isolation practices. The SHU's influence is psychological. Its reputation is built on extreme control, sensory deprivation, high-risk offenders, national security inmates, inmates whose violence or influence cannot be contained elsewhere. Even those who have never seen the inside of the SHU know what it represents. A man once said during an Edmonton Max range meeting, I can handle the Max. I can handle the fights. I can handle the lockdowns. But don't send me to Quebec. The SHU is where the system sends the inmates who have run out of places to run. It is, in some ways, the end of the line. Not geographically, but psychologically. And that reputation shapes behavior across every maximum security facility in the country. The legacy of violence, and the questions Canada still struggles to answer. Canada has fewer prisons than the United States. Fewer violent offenders. Fewer lifers. A fundamentally different philosophical approach to justice. But Edmonton Max and the SHU are reminders that no system, no matter how humane its foundation, escapes the need to confront extreme cases. The legacy of these institutions forces Canada to wrestle with questions that do not have simple answers. How do you rehabilitate someone who has killed inside prison? How do you protect inmates from each other? How do you protect staff from constant threat? How do you treat mental illness inside environments that exacerbate it? How do you prevent radicalization or gang recruitment inside violent spaces? How do you give hope to men serving sentences that offer none? And how do you uphold human rights while responding to human danger? Every riot, every death, every assault, every transfer to the SHU forces policymakers, officers, psychologists, and communities to reconsider these questions. Sometimes they find answers. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes the answers raise new questions. But the prisons remain. The final face of maximum security, a mirror. What most people don't realize is that maximum security prisons do not just contain individuals. They reveal them. Inmates become extreme versions of themselves. Those inclined toward violence become more violent. Those inclined toward reflection become philosophers. Those inclined toward manipulation become strategists. Those inclined toward fear become shadows. Officers become extreme versions of themselves. The patient become anchors. The arrogant become liabilities. The calm become leaders. The impulsive become dangers to others. And Canada itself, through these prisons, reveals its own contradictions. A country that values rehabilitation but maintains institutions built on incapacitation. A country that believes in human rights but houses some inmates in near total isolation. A country that prides itself on peace, yet must contain people shaped by lifelong violence. Edmonton Max and the SHU are not just prisons. They are mirrors, harsh, unyielding, unflinching. And what they reflect is uncomfortable. The men who never leave. There are inmates who will die inside these walls. Some because of life sentences. Some because of natural causes. Some because of violence. Some because their minds collapse long before their bodies. Some because the institution becomes the only reality they understand. Their stories will never be fully known. Their names will never become public. Their voices will never reach beyond the concrete. But they are the true legacy of maximum security. Not the riots. Not the escapes. Not the scandals. The men who live long enough to become monuments inside the system, reminders of what happens when violence, trauma, criminality, and confinement bend together into a single shape. One officer once said of an aging inmate, "He is part of the building now. If he left, the place would echo different."